The Boeing 777 was 3 hours into its transatlantic flight when disaster struck. Both pilots fell ill simultaneously, leaving 280 passengers and 12 crew members helpless at 39,000 feet. "We need anyone with aviation experience to come forward immediately," the chief flight attendant announced. Robert Thompson felt his irregular heartbeat quicken as he unbuckled his seatbelt in row 14. What nobody on Flight 6063 knew was that their salvation was sitting in an economy seat, medically grounded and traveling as a regular passenger for the first time in his adult life. Welcome to Real Security Stories, where we uncover the moments when ordinary passengers become extraordinary heroes. Before we dive into this incredible story of medical challenges, lost dreams and ultimate redemption, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe that sometimes our greatest trials prepare us for our most important moments, hit that subscribe button. These stories need to be told. Robert Thompson had been staring out the window of seat 14C for the past hour, watching the endless expanse of Atlantic Ocean stretch beneath Flight 63. At 52, he should have been in the cockpit of this very aircraft, not crammed into an economy seat with barely enough legroom for his 6-foot frame. The irony wasn't lost on him. This Boeing 777-300ER was the exact same model he had piloted for United Airlines for over 2 decades. 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days. That's how long it had been since the Federal Aviation Administration had revoked his medical certificate due to cardiac arrhythmia. The irregular heartbeat that had developed seemingly overnight had ended a 25-year career that had taken him to every continent and through every conceivable weather condition and emergency scenario. Robert had always been proud of his safety record. Over 15,000 flight hours without a single incident. He had guided aircraft through thunderstorms, ice storms, and mechanical failures. He had made emergency landings in crosswinds that would terrify most pilots. His colleagues respected him, his passengers trusted him, and his family had grown accustomed to the pride that came with having Captain Thompson as their patriarch. All of that had ended in a cardiologist's office on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 years ago. "I'm sorry, Captain Thompson," Dr. Williams had said, reviewing the EKG results. "The arrhythmia is unpredictable and potentially dangerous. The FAA medical standards are very clear. You cannot maintain your commercial pilot's license with this condition." Robert had argued, pleaded, and sought second opinions. He had undergone every test, tried every treatment, and consulted with the best cardiac specialists in the country. But the arrhythmia persisted, and with it, the end of everything that had defined him as a man. Today's flight from London to New York was Robert's first time traveling as a passenger on a commercial airline since his medical discharge. He had avoided flying entirely for 3 years, unable to bear the thought of sitting in a cabin while someone else commanded the aircraft he knew better than his own car. But his daughter's wedding in Manhattan had finally forced him onto this plane. Elizabeth had begged him to come, and after months of therapy and soul-searching, Robert had decided it was time to face his fears and his losses. He had booked the cheapest seat available, a symbolic gesture that marked his transition from captain to civilian. The carry-on bag in the overhead compartment contained a small reminder of his former life, his pilot's logbook, documenting every flight he had ever made, and his revoked medical certificate. He carried them everywhere, like a veteran might carry military medals, symbols of service that could never be taken away, even when the service itself had ended. Robert had noticed the pilots during boarding, Captain Williams and First Officer Rodriguez. Both were young, competent-looking professionals who reminded him of himself 20 years ago. He had resisted the urge to introduce himself, knowing that his grounded status would only create an awkward conversation about medical disqualification and career endings. As the flight progressed normally through the first 3 hours, Robert had begun to relax slightly. The aircraft was performing well, the weather was clear, and the crew was professional. Maybe, he thought, he could learn to be a passenger after all. Then the announcement came that changed everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Chief Flight Attendant Patricia Williams speaking." The voice over the intercom carried a tension that immediately caught Robert's attention. "We're experiencing a medical emergency in the cockpit. I need all passengers to remain seated and calm while we address this situation." Robert's pilot instincts kicked in immediately. A medical emergency in the cockpit could mean many things, but none of them were good. He watched as several flight attendants moved quickly toward the front of the aircraft, their professional composure barely masking obvious concern. The passenger next to him, a businessman who had been working on his laptop, looked up nervously. "What do you think that means?" he asked. Robert didn't answer. He was listening to the subtle changes in the aircraft's behavior. The slight increase in engine noise that suggested autopilot adjustments. The almost imperceptible change in cabin pressure that indicated altitude modifications. His trained ear could read an aircraft's condition like a doctor reading vital signs. 5 minutes passed before the next announcement, and this one sent a chill through the entire cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need your immediate attention." Chief Flight Attendant Williams' voice was now clearly strained. "We have experienced a serious medical emergency affecting both of our pilots. They are currently incapacitated and unable to continue flying the aircraft." The cabin erupted in gasps and worried murmurs. Robert felt his heart rate increase, not just from anxiety, but from the arrhythmia that had ended his career. The irregular rhythm that had grounded him was now pounding in response to the crisis unfolding around him. "The aircraft is currently operating on autopilot and is stable," Williams continued. "However, we need anyone with aviation experience to come forward immediately. If you have pilot training or flight experience of any kind, please identify yourself to a flight attendant right away." Robert closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Around him, 280 passengers were beginning to panic as the full implications of their situation became clear. They were trapped at 39,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean with no one qualified to land the aircraft. Except for one person. Robert's mind raced through the technical realities of their situation. A Boeing 777 could fly on autopilot for hours, but it couldn't land itself. Someone would need to take manual control of the aircraft, navigate to an appropriate airport, and execute a safe landing. In ideal conditions, it was a routine procedure that he had performed thousands of times. But these weren't ideal conditions. Robert hadn't touched aircraft controls in over 3 years. His medical condition made him legally unfit to pilot an aircraft. If his arrhythmia flared during a critical phase of flight, he could potentially make the situation worse instead of better. But 280 passengers and 12 crew members were depending on someone to save them, and Robert Thompson was the only person on that aircraft with the knowledge and experience to attempt it. A flight attendant was moving through the cabin, asking passengers directly if they had any aviation experience. Robert watched as she approached his row, knowing that in 30 seconds he would have to make a decision that could save or doom everyone on board. "Sir, do you have any pilot experience?" the flight attendant asked the businessman next to him. "No, I'm sorry," the man replied nervously. She turned to Robert. "What about you, sir?" Robert looked into her eyes and saw desperation mixed with hope. Behind her, he could see passengers craning their necks to hear his response. Children were crying, adults were praying, and everyone was looking for someone, anyone who might be able to save them. "Yes," Robert said quietly. "I'm a retired airline captain. I flew this exact aircraft type for over 20 years. The relief on the flight attendant's face was immediate and overwhelming. "Thank God," she whispered. "Please come with me immediately." As Robert stood and followed her toward the front of the aircraft, he felt every eye in the cabin watching him. These people were placing their lives in his hands, trusting him to overcome not just the technical challenges of flying the aircraft, but also the medical condition that had ended his career. Chief Flight Attendant Williams met them at the cockpit door. "Are you really a pilot?" she asked urgently. "Captain Robert Thompson, retired. 25 years with United Airlines. Qualified on this aircraft type," Robert replied, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded respect in cockpits around the world. "Both pilots are unconscious," Williams explained as she opened the cockpit door. "We believe it's severe food poisoning from the crew meal. They became ill within minutes of each other about 10 minutes ago." Robert entered the cockpit and immediately assessed the situation. Captain Williams and First Officer Rodriguez were both slumped in their seats, unconscious but breathing. The aircraft was indeed operating on autopilot, maintaining altitude and heading according to the flight plan programmed into the flight management system. Robert slipped into the captain's seat, his hands moving automatically to positions he had occupied thousands of times before. The muscle memory was still there. The location of every switch, every display, every control. This cockpit was as familiar to him as his own living room. But as he reached for the radio to contact air traffic control, his heart began to race with the irregular rhythm that had destroyed his career. London Control. This is United Flight 6030. Robert spoke into the radio with the calm professionalism that had defined his career. We have a medical emergency. Both pilots are incapacitated, and I am a passenger with commercial pilot qualifications taking control of the aircraft. The response from air traffic control was immediate. United 6063, Roger. Can you confirm your qualifications and current aircraft status? London Control, I am Captain Robert Thompson, retired United Airlines, type rated on Boeing 777. Aircraft is currently stable on autopilot at flight level 3. We need immediate priority handling for diversion to the nearest suitable airport. Robert's hands moved across the control panel, checking systems and verifying the aircraft's condition. Everything appeared normal. Engines running smoothly. Fuel sufficient for several more hours of flight. All systems operating within parameters. The aircraft itself was performing perfectly. The only problem was that its designated pilots were unable to fly it. United 6063, we're coordinating with Shannon Airport in Ireland for your diversion. Can you confirm you're qualified to execute the approach and landing? Robert paused before answering. Legally, he wasn't qualified to do anything in this cockpit. His medical certificate had been revoked. His license was invalid, and he was technically a passenger who had no business touching these controls. But 280 people were depending on him to get them safely on the ground. London Control. I am qualified and will execute the approach, Robert replied. However, I need you to be aware that I have been medically disqualified from commercial aviation due to cardiac arrhythmia. I am taking control of this aircraft as an emergency measure only. The admission felt like both a confession and a liberation. For 3 years, Robert had hidden his medical condition from most people, embarrassed by the weakness that had ended his career. Now he was broadcasting it to air traffic controllers across the Atlantic, acknowledging that the very condition that had grounded him might also affect his ability to save the lives depending on him. United 663, Roger, your medical status. We're coordinating with Shannon Airport and emergency services. Maintain current heading while we prepare vectors for approach. Robert began the process of briefing himself on the approach to Shannon Airport. He pulled up the airport information on the flight management system, reviewed the weather conditions, and calculated fuel requirements. It was a routine he had performed thousands of times, but never under these circumstances. Chief Flight Attendant Williams appeared at the cockpit door. Captain Thompson, how are you doing? Do you need anything? I need you to prepare the cabin for landing, Robert replied without taking his eyes off the instruments. We're going to Shannon Airport in Ireland. Tell the passengers that we have the situation under control, but they should be prepared for emergency services to meet the aircraft as a precaution. Are you going to be able to land this plane? Williams asked directly. Robert's heart skipped a beat. Literally. The arrhythmia was becoming more pronounced as stress and adrenaline affected his system. He had always wondered if the irregular heartbeat would impair his cognitive function during high-stress situations. Now he was about to find out. I'm going to do everything in my power to get everyone home safely, Robert answered. I've landed this aircraft type hundreds of times. The only difference today is that I'm not supposed to be doing it. As the aircraft began its descent toward Shannon, Robert felt the familiar rhythm of a precision approach. Check altitude. Check speed. Check heading. Verify navigation aids. Confirm runway assignment. Brief the approach procedure. Despite his medical condition and the circumstances, his pilot training was taking over. The autopilot was handling most of the flying, but Robert knew that he would need to take manual control for the final approach and landing. That would be the true test, not just of his technical skills, but of his ability to perform under pressure while managing a medical condition that could affect his performance at any moment. United 66, they're expecting you and have emergency services standing by. Robert switched radio frequencies and established contact with Shannon Approach. Shannon Approach, United 66-3, with you descending to flight level 100 as directed. United 66-3, Shannon Approach. We have you on radar. Be aware that we've cleared all other traffic from your arrival path. You'll have priority handling straight to runway 24. Current weather is wind 240 at 15 knots. Visibility 10 kilometers. Few clouds at 3,000 feet. The weather conditions were good, not perfect, but well within the capabilities of both the aircraft and Robert's experience level. Under normal circumstances, this would be a routine approach and landing. But these weren't normal circumstances. As the aircraft descended through 20,000 feet, Robert began to feel the physical effects of stress on his cardiac condition. His heart rate was becoming increasingly irregular, and he was beginning to experience the lightheadedness that sometimes accompanied severe arrhythmia episodes. Shannon approach, United 6063. I need to advise that the pilot in command is experiencing medical issues related to a cardiac condition. I will continue the approach, but please have medical personnel standing by for the flight crew as well as passengers. United 6063. Medical personnel are standing by. Can you continue the approach safely? Robert looked at the instruments in front of him, then at the approach chart for Shannon Airport. This was the moment of truth. He could continue the approach and risk the possibility that his medical condition might incapacitate him during the most critical phase of flight, or he could declare himself unable to continue and hope that someone else on the aircraft might be able to help. But Robert knew there was no one else. He had been the only passenger to respond to the call for pilot experience. If he couldn't complete this landing, 280 people would likely die. Shannon approach, United 6030. Continuing approach. At 5,000 feet, Robert disconnected the autopilot and took manual control of the aircraft for the first time in over 3 years. The feeling was both familiar and terrifying. His hands knew exactly how to fly this machine, but his heart was beating so irregularly that he was beginning to worry about losing consciousness. The Boeing 777 responded to his control inputs exactly as he remembered. Despite the years away from the cockpit, the aircraft felt like an extension of his own body. Every movement of the control column, every adjustment of thrust, every correction for wind was automatic and precise. United 6063. You're on a perfect glide path. Continue approach runway 24, wind 240 at 12. Robert could see Shannon Airport ahead, the runway lights clearly visible in the distance. Around him, the cockpit was exactly as he remembered. Familiar sounds, familiar sights, familiar procedures. For a moment it was as if the past 3 years had never happened, as if he had never been grounded, as if he was still the respected airline captain he had once been. But his irregular heartbeat reminded him that this was not a normal flight, and he was not a normal pilot anymore. At 1,000 feet above the ground, Robert's training took over completely. Years of experience, thousands of landings, countless hours of emergency procedures training. All of it came together in the final minute of Flight 6063's journey. United 6633. Cleared to land runway 24. Emergency vehicles are in position. Cleared to land United 663. The aircraft touched down on Shannon's runway with barely a vibration. Robert applied reverse thrust and brakes, bringing the massive aircraft to a controlled stop as emergency vehicles raced alongside. The landing was as smooth as any he had executed during his active career. For the first time in over 4 hours, Robert allowed himself to breathe. As the aircraft came to a complete stop, Robert sat in the captain's seat for a moment, his hands still on the controls, his heart still racing with irregular rhythm. Around him, the cockpit was quiet except for the sound of engines winding down and emergency radio chatter from the ground. Chief Flight Attendant Williams appeared in the cockpit doorway, tears streaming down her face. "Captain Thompson, you did it. You saved everyone." Through the cockpit windows, Robert could see emergency medical personnel boarding the aircraft to attend to the incapacitated pilots. Fire trucks and ambulances surrounded the aircraft, and ground personnel were moving quickly to establish jet bridges for passenger evacuation. Shannon Tower, United 63 is safely on the ground with all souls aboard, Robert reported. "We'll need medical attention for both pilots and possibly for the pilot in command as well." United 63, roger. "Excellent work. Emergency personnel are boarding now." As medical technicians entered the cockpit to check on Captains Williams and Rodriguez, Robert slowly stood up from the captain's seat. His legs were shaky. His heart was still beating irregularly, but he was overwhelmed by a sense of accomplishment that he hadn't felt in 3 years. A paramedic approached him with a medical kit. "Sir, we understand you have a cardiac condition. We'd like to check you out." "I'm fine," Robert replied. "Please take care of the pilots first." They're the ones who really need medical attention. But as he stepped out of the cockpit and into the cabin, Robert was greeted by something he hadn't expected. 280 passengers on their feet, applauding. Children were crying with relief, adults were cheering, and flight attendants were openly weeping with joy. "Thank you," called out a woman from row 20. "You saved our lives." "You're a hero," shouted a man from the back of the plane. Robert felt tears welling up in his eyes. For 3 years, he had felt like a failure. A pilot who had been grounded because his body had betrayed him. Today, that same body, and the experience it carried, had saved nearly 300 lives. The subsequent investigation revealed that both pilots had indeed suffered severe food poisoning from contaminated crew meals. They had become ill within minutes of each other, creating a scenario that airline safety experts called extremely rare but catastrophic. Without Robert's intervention, Flight 63 would have continued flying on autopilot until it ran out of fuel and crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. Robert was treated at Shannon University Hospital for cardiac arrhythmia and stress-related symptoms. His condition stabilized after several hours, and doctors confirmed that while his heart condition had been exacerbated by the stress of the emergency, it had not impaired his cognitive function or motor skills during the flight. The Federal Aviation Administration, the European Aviation Safety Agency, and United Airlines all conducted thorough reviews of the incident. Robert's actions were deemed heroic and technically proficient, and his decision to take control of the aircraft was universally praised as the only viable option for saving the lives of everyone on board. More importantly for Robert, his daughter Elizabeth called him from New York, sobbing with relief and pride. "Dad, I always knew you were a hero, but now the whole world knows it too." 3 weeks after the Shannon landing, Robert received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Williams, the cardiologist who had originally grounded him. "Robert, I've been following the news about Flight 63, and I want you to come in for some tests." "Doctor, we both know my condition hasn't changed. The arrhythmia is still there. That's what I want to check," Dr. Williams replied. "Sometimes extreme stress can actually reset cardiac rhythm patterns. It's rare, but I've seen it happen before." The tests revealed something remarkable. Robert's cardiac arrhythmia had indeed improved significantly. The extreme stress of the emergency landing, combined with the adrenaline and focus required to save 280 lives, had somehow restored his heart to a more regular rhythm. "I can't explain it medically," Dr. Williams admitted, "but your heart rhythm is now within acceptable parameters for commercial aviation. If you want to pursue reinstatement of your medical certificate, I believe you'd have a strong case." Robert sat in the cardiologist's office, holding test results that could restore his career and his identity. 3 years ago, this office had been the place where his dreams died. Today, it might be where they came back to life. 6 months later, Captain Robert Thompson returned to the cockpit of a United Airlines Boeing 777, this time as a legitimate member of the flight crew. The FAA had reinstated his medical certificate after extensive testing and evaluation, and United Airlines had welcomed him back with a new appreciation for his experience and judgment. His first official flight back was from Chicago to London, almost the reverse of flights. As he walked through the terminal in his captain's uniform, Robert reflected on the journey that had brought him back to this moment. The cardiac condition that had ended his career had also been the catalyst for saving. The 3 years of forced retirement had given him a perspective on life and duty that he had never possessed before. The humility of sitting in seat 14C had reminded him that every passenger trusts their life to the pilots in the cockpit. During the pre-flight briefing with his new first officer, Robert shared something he had learned during his time away from aviation. Every flight is a gift. Every passenger is someone's family member going home. We're not just flying machines. We're protecting dreams and reuniting families. Today, Captain Robert Thompson continues to fly for United Airlines. But his approach to his profession has been forever changed by his experience as a passenger in sea. He carries with him not just the technical knowledge of decades of flight experience, but also the emotional understanding of what it means to trust your life to someone else. Robert has become an advocate for airline safety protocols and crew medical training. His experience with Flight 63 led to new procedures for handling cockpit medical emergencies and better training for flight attendants in identifying passengers with aviation experience. He also speaks regularly at medical conferences about the relationship between stress, cardiac conditions, and professional performance. His case has become a study in how extreme circumstances can sometimes produce unexpected medical outcomes. But most importantly, Robert has learned that sometimes the end of one chapter is just the beginning of another. The medical condition that grounded him became the vehicle for his redemption. The humiliation of sitting in economy class became the preparation for his greatest professional achievement. The passengers of United Flight 663 have stayed in touch with Robert through social media and annual reunion. They call themselves Thompson's 280, a reference to the number of lives he saved that day. Many of them have become amateur aviation enthusiasts, taking flight lessons and learning about aircraft systems as a way of honoring the man who brought them home safely. Elizabeth Thompson married in Manhattan as planned, with her father walking her down the aisle in his restored United Airlines captain's uniform. In her wedding speech, she told the assembled guests, "My father taught me that sometimes our greatest challenges prepare us for our most important moments." He spent 3 years thinking his flying career was over, only to discover that his most important flight was still ahead of him. The Boeing 777 that Robert landed at Shannon Airport has been retired from service and is now on display at the National Air and Space Museum. A plaque beside the aircraft reads, "This aircraft was safely landed at Shannon Airport by retired Captain Robert Thompson, a passenger who overcame medical disqualification to save 280 lives." His actions remind us that heroes often travel in seats we least expect. As Robert prepares for another transatlantic flight, he reflects on the words that Chief Flight Attendant Williams spoke on that desperate day over the Atlantic. "We need anyone with aviation experience to come forward immediately." Sometimes the call to service comes when we're at our lowest point, when we feel unqualified and unprepared. Sometimes our greatest defeats become the foundation for our most important victories. Sometimes the very thing that breaks us also makes us stronger. Robert Thompson's heart condition had taken away his identity as an airline captain. But when 280 people needed someone to bring them home safely, that same heart, irregular rhythm and all, carried him through the most important flight of his career. After all, you never know who's sitting in seat 14C. Sometimes our greatest failures prepare us for our most important moments. Captain Robert Thompson's story reminds us that medical conditions don't diminish experience, and retirement doesn't erase expertise. When lives hung in the balance, the man who wasn't supposed to fly became the only one who could. If this story moved you, subscribe to Real Security Stories for more accounts of ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges. And remember, expertise doesn't disappear with a medical certificate, and heroes don't always wear uniforms. Where are you watching from today? Have you ever met someone whose past prepared them for an unexpected moment of crisis? Share their story in the comments below. The man who had been grounded for medical reasons became the passenger who proved that expertise doesn't disappear with a revoked license, and courage doesn't diminish with a medical condition. Sometimes the most qualified person in the room is sitting in the cheapest seat, waiting for the moment when their experience is needed most. As Flight 445 pushes back from the gate at Chicago O'Hare, Captain Thompson takes one last look at the passenger cabin. Somewhere in those seats might be another grounded pilot, another retired professional, another person whose past might be the key to an uncertain future. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Thompson from the flight deck. We're expecting a smooth flight to London today, and we should arrive ahead of schedule. But Robert knows that the smoothest flights are the ones where the unexpected doesn't happen, where heroes don't need to reveal themselves, where passengers remain passengers and crew remain crew. Sometimes though, the unexpected happens at 39,000 feet, and ordinary people discover that they're capable of extraordinary things.